Now we're going to have people who are also on the ground, have fantastic experience to talk about new models for urban governance. And I could not imagine a better group of people here to discuss that. To my immediate left is the former 4-term mayor of Oklahoma City, Mick Cornett. You were the 35th mayor?
That's right.
35th mayor. And you were the first mayor in city history to be elected to a 4th term. Is that right?
First one to run for a 4th term. The others, y'all had the good sense to get out before that.
But when you left office, I think you were also the longest serving mayor. That's incredible. And before that, 2 decades local television. What did you do in local television?
I was a television newscaster, sports anchor, play-by-play broadcaster.
And then you went and reported in City Hall, right?
Yeah, and then I was, after the bombing, I kind of went through a reflection on my life and decided I wanted to do something that I felt at the time was more meaningful. And started covering City Hall, and that's when I kind of fell in love with local government and realized you could make a difference there. And so I left television, ran for city council, and then ran for mayor.
Well, speaking of Mayor Tom Tait, you were mayor of Anaheim from 2010 to 2018. Did I get that right?
That's right.
And before becoming mayor, member of city council, you served as CEO of Tait and Associates, Tait Environmental Services Incorporated, board member representing the 4th District in the Orange County Transportation Authority. Just looking at your background, you've worn so many hats in local service.
A few, I guess. The most important being mayor, by far, actually. And when Mick is, you didn't mention also you're president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and we got to know each other through that. So amongst all the mayors in the country, we chose him to be our leader. So you're a very humble guy, but I want to make sure you didn't forget that.
Yeah, and I think that's when I met you too. You were coming to D.C. and was at a gathering that you were hosting. Last but certainly not least, Greg Brooks, longtime friend, co-founder and president of the Better Cities Project. Before that, you were principal of West 3rd Group, previously led public affairs for the LA-based Reason Foundation. You worked for the Goldwater Institute. You did national outreach for Compact for America, a host of other groups, but now Better Cities Project, that's what brings you here.
I feel like I finally got it right.
Well, we're going to talk about Better Cities. Mayor Cornett, I want to talk with you. You wrote an entire book on smart ways to lead cities today. It's kind of the theme of what we're talking about now. That book, by the way, you should definitely get it. It's The Next American City. You looked at dynamic, mid-sized cities across America and asked, what is it about their governance, the policy chops, civic engagement, urban design that made them successful? What was the secret sauce? What did you find?
Well, we were looking at that millennial generation and the generation behind them and noticing that more so than previous generations, they were more likely to want to choose to take on their life in a medium-sized city in the middle of the country. It was no longer just about the East or the West Coast. It was no longer just about the largest cities. There was something appealing about a lower cost of living, perhaps less traffic congestion, perhaps fresher water and cleaner air, or some combination of all of those things. There was just a different set of priorities that was being embedded in these highly educated 20-somethings, and there was an opportunity there for mid-sized cities to seize opportunities to create cities that would attract that generation. And economic development is really about attracting highly educated 20-somethings. If you can do that, it's pretty easy to figure out the rest of it.
Talent's a big part of it. Okay.
It's human capital.
Mayor Tait, did you find something similar? I mean, and I'm going to have a follow-up question for you as well, but what did you find was the secret sauce to success, given your experience?
Well, so I had served for, 10 years on the city council, all the way back to 1994 to 04. So I thought I was done. And so I had, then I was elected mayor in 2010. But back in 2004, I had run across this gentleman. His Dr. Jajewski. He's from Anaheim, and he's actually from Argentina. He's a holistic doctor. And he had told me a story about his daughter, a little 6-year-old daughter, Natasha, who was actually killed in an car accident that summer before. And they found she had written all these beautiful things about kindness. So then Dr. Jayevsky says, he says, in medicine, you can either treat the symptoms or you could stimulate the body to heal from within holistically. He said, that's what I do as a holistic doctor. Then he said, I think the same principle applies to a city. You either treat the symptoms or you can stimulate the city to heal from within holistically. And he says, I think that has something to do with kindness. And so anyway, for me, that was a light bulb moment. And 6 years later, I felt compelled to run for mayor on a platform of kindness, actually. And it's about changing the culture, because we all know it's all about culture. Culture is more important than anything else. If you get culture to change, how people think. And so, at the end of the day, if you could get people in Anaheim thinking we're a city of kindness, I have kind of a civic duty to be a little kinder to my neighbor, to others, then the chance of that person doing something kind is a little bit greater. And if you could get to that point, literally everything you could think of in your city gets better. So it was under that principle about culture change, and I ran.
So the title of this panel, New Models for Urban Governance, we've talked a lot about nuts and bolts, strategies, taxation, all sorts of other things. One thing that I do want to get at, that I think you're touching on, is there a role for the mayor to use that position, the bully pulpit, to push for change, to push for things that may be outside of your wheelhouse? Or should you be careful about that? And I'm also thinking of you. You led a campaign in Oklahoma City, a weight loss campaign across the whole city. Is there a role for the mayor, beyond just the nuts and bolts, to lead a culture change in a city?
Yeah, I think, in fact, it's a fairly unique role. I think the mayor's the only one in American politics that seems to be able to get away with those types of endeavors. There's a political instinct when you get elected, and you have to fight this if you're ever elected to anything. You want to tell people what they want to hear. I mean, it's just instinctual. I want to be liked. I want this crowd to cheer when I walk off the stage. And you have to fight that. And what I found that I thought was interesting in looking back on my years in public life, it seems like the more time I told people what they didn't want to hear, the more popular I got. And I can't explain that.
But how does that work?
I don't know exactly why, but I think maybe my years in broadcasting had helped train me how to talk to people. And being able to talk to people and leveling with them was so refreshing, because there's so many other different levels of politics where they feel like people are talking at them. And if there's, one of the many instincts in Oklahoma politics is people really want government to just leave them alone. I mean, that's what a lot of people in Oklahoma would say. And so, if you're understanding and you're able to talk to people and level with them, if people are listening, they probably appreciate it more, and they're going to notice it, because it's not typical of what they hear or what they, hear from partisan politics.
Do you feel, and I'm going to actually turn to you on this, Greg, are you hearing across the country a sense that citizens are wanting their mayors to step into that kind of role? And part of the reason I'm asking this is a quick caveat, is there's this regular Menino Mayors Survey Boston University does, and the most recent one said, what's on the top of mayors' minds? It's mental health. And it's what they see in their constituents, they're concerned what they're seeing. Is that related? Are you seeing mayors use their role to address those kind of societal issues?
Yes, but I think it can come from a good and strategic place. It can come from a reactionary place, right? And not all of those instincts are equal or should be treated equally. One of the things that we hear most from mayors is that, this was verified in that same survey you mentioned a few years ago, most mayors, their number one source of policy ideas are other mayors. So it's a bit of a fishbowl environment. And our politics and citizens' desire for change drive a reactionary cycle, right? We're no longer in a world where, I'm old enough to remember when the right stood for small local government, period, full stop. And I am old enough to remember when the left stood for an expansive social safety net. Well, I can go into any mid-sized city in America and I can find very conservative single-family homeowners willing to embrace whatever big government is necessary for an apartment not to get built in their neighborhood. I can find progressives who are willing to donate all the money in the world to left-leaning causes and don't want a homeless shelter built in their neighborhood. So in a sense, government has become an ATM for people and their desires. And to get back to your point, the reason that matters is that I think those desires from the citizenry and to what Chuck was talking about, this vertical nature of how governments operate internally, makes it hard to do the big expansive things. Lots of mayors want to do it. My advice is always be at least a 2-term mayor, because you're going to spend your first term developing the community trust you need to do really transformative things. Government is not transformative. Government is, especially local government, a game of inches.
Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, and I think the big thing is culture change. And if you could get that, that is much more powerful than you mentioned, the nuts and bolts things or passing ordinances. If you could get people thinking differently, and in my case with Anaheim, if people thinking we're a city of kindness, the chance of doing something kind is a little bit greater. As far as economic development, I don't think it's about I certainly don't think it's about giving big subsidies to companies to bring them to my city or whatever. I think that's a waste of money. And there's studies that show, Kauffman Foundation said if you want economic growth, don't offer money to the Amazons and folks. Or in Anaheim, it was actually Disney and big hoteliers and things like that, big subsidies. They said don't do that. But the biggest predictor of economic growth in your city is having a large immigrant population. Kind of, Chuck, what you were talking about. And you have, which Anaheim is a giant immigrant population. And so that kind of ties into kindness. I mean, so our economic plan was basically based on kindness and working with the schools and the kids and giving them confidence that if you were a poor kid in Anaheim and your parents are working and changing beds at the resort district, 2 shifts, would give that kid confidence that he or she can one day start their own business. Right? And I'm thinking that comes from kindness. And I was thinking, Mayor Johnson, you mentioned what you tell, your favorite day is talking to the kids. Mine was too. But I'm thinking about that conversation you had, or you have, is like work hard, and then kind people will come and help you along the way. And if you have more kind people doing that, the better everything gets. And that's so anyway. I think it's a bigger thing. Is about culture change and kind of a spiritual thing. And really, Chuck, I loved what you were talking about, the beauty of the city. I think that's where and a mayor, I know I'm going on too long, but a mayor, a city is a natural thing where people come together. It's not a congressional district or even a state, but a city, people for eons have been coming together to form cities. And so those cities have a natural leader, and it's called a mayor. And our city's like yours, Eric. And I know Will's is also, and Mayor Lincoln, I don't know if yours is too, but if we don't have a majority of the council with us, we don't have enough power to buy a cup of coffee. But we've got that bully pulpit, and I think the big power of a mayor is using that and affecting culture and creating a core value and just talking about it.
This is actually a great point, because you invoked Mayor Johnson's point on the weak mayor system versus strong mayor and different forms of weak mayor. How much is the fight for culture change a byproduct of not really having much authority and power as a chief executive in some cities? Should we be pushing for strong mayor systems, or is that not at all the point? I wonder if you have some thoughts, because you've, Mayor Cornett, like you've seen.
I do. We have the city manager form of government. I always felt like, I say always, through the years, I felt like the fact that I had so little constitutional authority actually worked to my advantage, because people wanted one person to speak for the city. The business community wanted one person to go to. The council really wanted someone to kind of take charge. And so one of my instincts is whenever I see a void in leadership is to attempt to fill it. And I always felt like because we were constitutionally so limited in power, that you were actually able to seize great authorities of power through working with other people. And I always defined leadership as getting other people to want what you want and building a consensus. So, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons that we had so much success in Oklahoma City, because, you know, coming from the media and coming as a City Hall reporter, I also realized that, you know, whenever an executive branch person is trying to exert great authority, it's almost as if it's the media's job to make sure they don't get any credit for that. You know, it's like people are always trying to take away your authority when you try to exert it. But if they know you don't really have any, it's almost as if then you come across as a person who's really trying to accomplish something because they believe in it. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's to a certain point unique or almost unique to Oklahoma City and the kind of the history of the mayors that came before me. But I've always felt like even though it's considered a weak mayoral position, the mayor of Oklahoma City, as long as they don't abuse that power, actually has created a great amount of authority and power through just the attrition of the job and being able to lead people and lead other leaders.
And it's about communicating that to the constituents as well. I imagine social media now is a big part of that, various forms of communication.
More so, but yeah, I would say it's
but
also
getting into the
important
neighborhood.
If people don't suspect you have a hidden agenda, if people really believe that you genuinely are in it for other things, if the city always comes first ahead of your own personal wants and your own personal needs and your own political career, if people really believe you're putting the city first, they are much more likely to follow you when you need their help.
So I want to turn to you, Greg, because you talk with local leaders all across the country. Do you see consistent themes in successful mayors, but also successful governance forms that they've enacted or adopted that help generate more impact?
So one of the successful themes, building on what you said, is the mayor as visionary. Often in systems of government where the city council members are elected by district, the mayor is elected citywide. What happens is the city council member becomes lacking any policy vision of their own or the ability to implement a policy vision single-handedly. That office becomes, in a few cities, a nexus for graft and corruption, but in most cities, it's much more subtle. It becomes a nexus for gatekeeping. There is no more powerful gatekeeper of no than the council member who has the power to bring virtually any development project or zoning variance to a vote, right? That's a good way to stop your city from growing vigorously and organically. In terms of policy reforms, I'm a big fan of two things that I've seen in very different markets. I want to say Charlotte, you can correct me if it's Raleigh, but they eliminated their citizen advisory board for development, which is a politically costly thing to do, right? Who wants to eliminate citizen input? But you know what happens is the citizen input 90% of the time was no. Yeah. And so I'd like to, we've written about that, and I'd like to see more cities see that that's an option. One of the projects that we're really fond of and would like to see other cities pursue is what they did in New Rochelle, New York, a wealthy suburb of the New York metro area that had not seen new downtown development for the better part of 8 years, I believe. And what they did is two things that have not together been done anywhere else in the country, and we're excited to see other cities try it. They did a downtown-wide EIR to eliminate the cost of that, and they went out and talked to the
EIR is?
Environmental Impact Report. So every project previously that came in needed to do its own report. It was costly, and you can tell those of you who've dealt with developers know this. Developers might not like hearing no. No is far preferable to, I don't know, we'll see.
Yeah.
because that costs money. No doesn't cost you money. So they did an EIR for the entire downtown, which meant developers didn't have to do their own. And then they worked with a master developer who put up $2 million to help the city streamline and reduce time to market for its zoning and planning processes. Fully privately funded, fully publicly supervised. The developer did not show up with a plan that nobody had any input on. But as a result, this relatively small suburb has now seen billions of dollars of investment just in the last couple of years, all based on eliminating uncertainty. So that is a specific example of a broader theme, which is identify the pain points that are keeping capital inflows from happening as smoothly as possible, address those, and then you start to get wealth in the community instead of more expenses and more useless
Greg,
projects.
so you bring up something that I'd like to ask either one of you to respond to. That's the role of the private sector, nonprofits, to help you get your agenda across the finish line. So you think of governance, a lot of the conversation now has been about what levers of City Hall or government or the council that you can pull to get something across the finish line. Did you find that, under Mayor Bloomberg in New York City, he had a nonprofit that he could turn to help smooth barriers in the way to getting to yes, or it was all about finding those nonprofit and private sector alliances and partnerships to get stuff done. What have you seen work along those lines, or do you completely disagree with that notion?
No, a couple things pop into mind. Again, things holding back entrepreneurs or city over years, regulations is a one-way valve. There's a problem, city passes an ordinance, there's a regulation, and they don't go away. And you have a bunch of dumb ones out there that just make it different, the more no's along the way. So I put together a task force, called it a task force, and of a group of people interested to cut back regulations, brought our staff in, planning director, people like that who normally you might not think would want to do that, but everyone was on board under we called it under a freedom agenda. And so we cut a bunch of regulations, put a concierge at our city hall, so a small business person comes in or someone, an entrepreneur, has no idea what goes on at City Hall, could go to this concierge, and that concierge can help him or her get their permit. It's super simple, cut a bunch of regulations, and things took off, and one of the things was breweries. And we grew from like 1 to about 20, which to me was an awesome thing, because it actually brings people together in the community also. And then with the kindness, when I got elected, how do we do this? I went to not all of them, but most of them, the churches and the mosques and synagogues and the faith-based community. I said, here's what we want to do. We want to be known as a city of kindness, and help me. And they were doing it anyway, but it helped organize that. And then I went to the schools, and our school district, elementary school district, they did 1 million acts of kindness to kids, which just took off. And it was very easy but you could do that as a mayor and say, this is important. And it was just one meeting with the superintendent, and away it went. And then it took off from there.
See, one of the major roles of city government is to create an environment where the private sector can create private sector jobs. I don't think there's anything more important that I took more satisfaction from than thinking I might have played a small role in creating a new job or a better job for someone out there who might be hurting or might be having a tough time making it. And so I was very job conscious, and I've been characterized as the Chamber of Commerce candidate, and that's probably fair. But
They meant that as a bad thing.
Well, in some communities that would be considered a bad thing.
In full confession, I used to work for the chamber.
It's not in my community.
Yeah.
But I say that, putting my journalistic hat on. If I'm applying a label to myself and I'm called the Chamber of Commerce candidate in an election, I understand that's fair. I do seek the support of business leaders from a political standpoint.
And was that crucial to to executing your agenda for downtown Oklahoma City? Because I remember as a kid going through Oklahoma City and what it became under your leadership. It was night and day. Business leaders, nonprofit, they had to have played a role in that as well.
Well, absolutely, and it always helps if you want to be viewed as an effective mayor. The most important thing is to have really good predecessors, because in a city manager form of government, generally, if a city is doing well and you walk in and you think, man, this thing's really happening, you should ask, who's the city manager today? And who was the mayor and council 5 years ago or 10 years ago? Because as he pointed out, the mayor and council in that type of role really do need to be more visionary and be setting a conversation about what do we need to do next, while the city manager continues to run the city on a day-to-day basis. If you have an effective city manager, which we were fortunate enough to have, then the mayor and council can spend their time on grand initiatives that can do game-changing things, but may take 5 or 10 years to fully develop.
What if you don't have an effective city manager?
That's a problem. I remember 4 or 5 years ago, and I was reminded of that this morning while we were listening to the conversation. I got a call from a California mayor. I won't say what city. I don't even remember the gentleman's name. But he had been elected, and he looked at some of the things that we'd accomplished in Oklahoma City and had been attributed to me, and he just assumed that I had a strong mayor system and I was able to accomplish all these things. And when he found out that was not the case, he was puzzled, because he was also in a city manager form of government, and he called to want to know how I was able to help engineer these things to happen. And as I mentioned before, I tend to not do anything. It was always we. It was never about me. But what I asked him some questions. I said, well, is the city council, do they want you to be successful? And he says, oh no, the city council doesn't like me at all. And I said, well, your city manager, is he working with you? He says, no, I ran against the sitting mayor, and the city manager doesn't like me either. And I said, well, you're doomed. I mean, if you're in the mayor-council form of government and the city council's against you and the city manager is against you, you are not going to be successful. And so I, kind of gave him some obvious advice. You need to start building some friends. You need to start working with your city manager coalition. You're going to be miserable. And I, to a certain extent, I never followed up. I don't know how that turned out. But I think it shows that in local government and in politics in general, you've got to build coalitions, and you've got to be able to convince people to want what you want, or to see things your way, or to do some give and take. And I always reminded myself, I always tried to keep my political capital for what was really important to me. And I had a saying that I kept on my desk, and it was, the big thing to remember is that the big thing is the big thing. And whenever I was the mayor, I always had one thing in the back of my mind, that's the big thing. And whenever some city council conversation would come up and there'd be some uproar, and it was hard for me to fight putting my 2 cents in, I just be quiet and save your political capital for what's really important for you. Don't let others draw you into some sort of conversation that's going to splinter your political coalition. Save your capital for what you think is truly important. And so, mayors in Oklahoma City are generally defined by a handful of initiatives that they build up their political capital to help pass. It's not, the day-to-day zoning case that might create a big crowd at City Hall, but no one's going to remember 2 weeks later.
It seems like this is really difficult these days. Now, this is not a disagreement with you, but it's more of a reflection.
Yeah.
It feels really difficult.
I'm glad you brought that up, because when I was hearing Mayor Johnson talk, it reminded me just how difficult the last 2 years have been for mayors. Right. And he and other mayoral leaders have almost been in crisis mode. And so I think a lot of the things I said 20 minutes ago about when I was the mayor, I don't know that they necessarily applied to the last 2 years. This was really tough. And I think it's probably unfair of me to assume that the style and the manner of leadership that I used during my 14 years would necessarily have worked as well the last 2. It might have taken a certain set of tools that I never had to exhibit find out if I possess.
Either for you, Mayor Tait, or for Greg, former New York Mayor LaGuardia had said there's basically no Republican Democrat way to pick up the garbage. It feels like there is these days somehow, like that everything is politicized. Maybe it's part of the era that we're in, or it's COVID. It also feels like it's something we touched on earlier in the day, how everything's just becoming nationalized.
Right.
So everything has a national tinge to it. And so I wonder what you, maybe Mayor Tait, have found in leaders, local leaders that you admire, and in your own experience, in kind of trying to push past that to get to something that is like everybody can commonly agree is a good form of management at the local level, regardless of R or D after your name.
Yeah, I'd say R&D is not what I'm interested in on dealing with people on my city council, and it doesn't really apply at the local level. We're nonpartisan in California or our city, and so it officially, but it really. So my closest ally, I call myself a Republican, kind of libertarian / conservative Republican. My closest ally by far was a Bernie progressive Democrat. And some Republicans weren't, and we disagreed on a lot of things, on big issues, mostly on subsidies to large corporations. So in Anaheim, it kind of broke that way. Do you think economic development or the path to our city is focusing on the big companies, or do you think it's focusing on the neighborhoods? And our philosophy was that if you have great neighborhoods, the businesses will follow. You don't have to, and you shouldn't. And you don't want to treat one business different than you treat that business and things like that. So it's those issues which both parties, I think, either agree to or disagree with.
I would say that in the cities that we work with, overwhelmingly the local offices you run for and win them on a nonpartisan basis. What we haven't solved for is a nonpartisan public, right? That's the X we haven't solved for, and people will bring their tribal things, and those are often. I used to say Republican and Democrat, and then I went to saying conservative and liberal, and now, it's a mess, right? To go back to my earlier example, people who I generally lean right, people who I might agree with on many, many, many issues, seem perfectly willing to roll up on City Hall and ask the government to guarantee their homes ever appreciating property value by limiting development, things like that. So I think it's into that environment of the government. Let me back up for a second. Local governments across the country all suffer this common problem of not having communicated or having tried to communicate, and the message was rejected, the notion of what it is exactly they do. Where are the walls in the room that define what local government does? Lacking that, people pour any damn thing they want into it, right? You see it from the public wanting City Hall to fix everything under the sun. You see it from local officials who will come up with often very strange ideas about what local government should be tackling.
But is there an argument that them turning to a mayor to fix those things is actually a testament to what they view the mayor as being? Somebody who listens, who's responsive? Is there a good side to that?
I think in the sense that a citywide elected mayor is in a fairly unique position to be an enabler and a convener of consensus, potentially. Doesn't always happen, but they are in a much better position to do that than a district level city council member. But they have to bring to the table a spirit of good bargaining and compromise, because that same power has enabled a lot of bad, big initiatives in cities across the country. No matter what you feel about climate change, the scientific reality is that an individual city in the U.S. can do almost nothing to meaningfully deal with that problem, and yet that is a highly ranked priority among a lot of mayors.
So we've talked about almost the mayor as this, this is my language, almost a heroic figure.
That's
very
a
admirable.
great phrase for it.
This
In this room,
that's right.
fantastic
Yeah.
You're on a
phrase.
roll.
but also constrained, right? Constrained in many ways.
Oh, that too.
One thing that I'm curious about that we really haven't talked on is election reform and election issues. The reason I'm bringing this up is there's been a spate of literature recently on how the kind of elections we have and the role of interest groups in politics do shape the role of mayor and shape who gets in there and shape all sorts of things. And so, even something as simple as do you have an on-cycle or off-cycle election can dramatically change who shows up on voting day, what interests they're trying to push for, which interest groups get in there to shape the political process. And then you even talked about nonpartisan offices. These days it's there's literature on how very busy voters have to know who this person is that's running for local office. Mayor, maybe they've been hearing what's been happening for who's running for that position, but go down from there, even to a city council member, they may not have any idea who this person is. And so they almost would look to, in theory, an RRD after the name to give them some indication of who this person is. But now there's even ideas of saying, well, we should not just have R and D after people's names. We should have the chamber on that ballot to say this is a chamber candidate. And any other local groups to just be able to have on-ballot endorsements, right? I'm not saying we should support that. What I'm saying is there's a lot of conversation now about elections mattering to what you can do as a mayor. Do you agree with that?
Let me just start out. I was listening to Mayor Johnson, Mayor Lincoln, and Will O'Neill talk about being mayor, sitting out there talking about their job, and I was actually missing. I don't know if you were, Mick, but missing being mayor. But when you talk about the election and the politics, I'm really grateful I'm former mayor. Let me put it that way, because it's terrible, I think. And I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't. It seems like a broken system, frankly. It certainly is in our city.
If I may.
Yeah.
I think that's the problem, but not the problem behind the problem, which is that a very common dynamic is that, particularly in mid-sized cities, people don't get elected on the basis of a strong policy platform or a policy background. They get elected because they have a great network in the community and or they ran a great campaign. So they get into office and suddenly it's a lot, right? And it's extraordinarily process driven, and worst case you get sort of dragged around by staff, led around by the nose by staff. Best case, you carve out some narrow issues and figure out what to do. I think that in order to getting some sort of flags, if you will, some signaling devices that allow voters to make better decisions is half of that equation. But the other half is broadly speaking, we need more policy-aware candidates running for office, people who have a fulsome idea of what the capability of the office is and what change they would like to see. I don't plan to solve that problem. That's a big problem.
Well, and maybe Mayor Cornett, you have some thoughts on this. I was talking to somebody who has a ton of experience in New York City government, been around for decades, and they said, what always happens when a new mayor comes into office is, everything's kind of fine-ish, and then there's a crisis. And what they inevitably do is they appoint a strong deputy mayor under them to ride roughshod over all the other deputy mayors and commissioners and council members, ideally, while the mayor can kind of focus on the big picture, the agenda, very positive, all that kind of stuff. How do you view that, especially vis-a-vis city council? understanding the constraints of especially a kind of a weak mayor model, city council, city hall, the agencies, what do you view as kind of like within your toolbox to be able to execute when crisis happens, like in a very concrete way?
Yeah, I don't know that you can compare my experiences to being the mayor of New York City. That is, I went to NYU for business school, and having been around, that city enough to sort of understand its politics, that is just such a giant of a machine. Not just the politics, but just the daily operations of Manhattan and the way that city operates. What I find interesting about New York politics from a mayoral standpoint is they always seem to elect the opposite of what they just had. It just seems like, well, that didn't work, let's try something else. I think, those of us from the outside, which I certainly am, we always cross our fingers and hope New York City can get it right. But it almost seems like as soon as a person is elected, the New York media and the other political machinery that are so involved inside that dynamic want to start tearing down, the very structure of the mayor's office, and it makes it really, really hard to lead. I had a habit when I was the mayor, is every day I would wake up and I would Google the word mayor, and I would read all the news stories
This feels dangerous.
mayors were doing, and it was fascinating to me, but I think it was really good because you see what was coming and what other mayors were dealing with. But the New York City mayor is obviously in that stream of news stories every day. And so I always just found it astonishing that you could expect a mayor to deal with that many big issues over and over and over again, and have that person have any sort of sanity or any meaningful consequences in how the city operated.
Sounds
It seemed to me
exhausting.
like it was just going to operate the way it was, regardless if you had a mayor or not. It was just on automatic pilot, and the city just somehow worked.
I'd say,
yeah.
I'd say when we had a crisis, officer-involved shooting way back in 2012, crisis, lost control of the city for a couple days as far as rioting and whatnot. And I don't know if New York, I think, I agree with Mick. I think it's just a whole different thing. It's almost more like a country or something.
Yeah.
But city our size, and Kevin, I don't know if it was San Diego or not, but you're pretty much on, as mayor, the city is looking for leadership. And it's pretty much you're on your own, and you got to figure that one out, and what you're going to say, and how you're going to bring the city together, and comfort people, and also show that the city's unified and strong. So, but there's not a lot of playbooks on this or anything. It's really you're just you're the person, and the city's looking for that leadership intently at that point.
So as a sense for guidance for reform, I'll ask this question of all of you, and then please, I'll turn to you for questions, so please think of them, write them down on the note cards, and we'll bring them up here. But if you were to think, just purely hypothetically, about the perfect sort of model for urban governance vis-a-vis the mayor, what do you think of or where do you look for the model and say, this is the right mix of institutional capacity, the right rules and the kind of authority that a mayor has, the right relationship with the city council. City council has, district members or at large. Just how do you conceive of the kind of ideal city hall?
I think the city almost reflects the culture of City Hall. In other words, I studied the city of Chicago, and I got to know Mayor Daley really well. And I always kept bouncing back, is Chicago the way it is because Mayor Daley is the way he is, or is Mayor Daley the way he is because the city of Chicago is the way it is? And I just kept bouncing back and forth. And I've heard that said about, other places as well. We heard earlier about, Tom Menino in Boston, and how he really reflected, he resonated Bostonian. And he was always, whatever he was saying and whatever he was for, he was doing it for the people of Boston. He was so believable and genuine. And you know, that style in both of those cities wouldn't work in Oklahoma City. But it works very well, you know, in those two cities. Those are fairly popular mayors in, you know, in mayoral history in this country, Menino and Daley. So, I mean, sometimes I think that, you know, there's a direct connection between a successful mayor and that city's culture and their history. And it's unfair to suggest that their system should be adopted by other places, because probably not.
And yet mayors learn most of all from other mayors. So clearly
Yes.
there is something.
But you have to pick and choose about what would work and what
Right.
wouldn't work. Right. And a lot of times we shake our heads and say, boy, that would never work here.
I think I like the city manager form of government, but I think the mayor, if I could change it, I'd give the mayor a veto power over the council, which I guess is a lot more power. But that way, because the mayor represents everybody, council members at districts, and it seems like the veto power would be a good balance. And then I would also figure out some sort of, and I'm very cautious on campaign limitations of campaign contributions, and I'm cautious on that because I know it's political speech, but it's at least in our city of Anaheim, it's gotten way out of control of special interests controlling the political process completely.
Greg, ideal forms of urban governance that you've seen?
Well, that I've seen that are ideal, none. That we're advocating and educating toward. I have a philosophical and an operational answer. The philosophical answer is that the role of an elected official in local government is to protect the rights of the citizens. And I think that we, and I mean the collective we in local government, sometimes lose track of that, because to Chuck's point, again, because it's such a good point, the way city governments have rearranged themselves like intelligent Legos is such that they are not automatically built to do that. Now, from an operational perspective, I think a lot of people come into local government thinking that they are in charge in a managerial sense. And really, as we heard earlier today, your role is much more akin to a board member. You are there for oversight far, far more than you are there for operations. And that's a good, it's a good litmus test for any local elected official is, okay, how hip deep am I in operations right now? And do I need to back up and instead provide the oversight for the staff to make sure that they're executing the vision that the people who voted for me have?
And clearly there is a difference between states and how constrained they also, how much they constrain cities in their state, right? So some states really work, some legislatures work overtime to constrain how much authority you may have.
Yeah, no, we all cities, I think, but I mean, I always thought it was just silly that we used to hire lobbyists to protect us from state government. I mean, that was their job. We were just playing defense. You know, people would say, what are you trying to get accomplished in your legislative session? We just want them to stop taking away the authorities they've given us. You know, so, I mean, I always thought that was so silly that we had to use taxpayer dollars to protect us from state government. But inevitably, I saw how entrenched that anti-municipal government thought process was at the state level. Every year they were trying to do something to harm the way that we had our revenue, or the way that we used our land use. They were always trying to take authorities away. And at the same time running on local government authority.
Right.
Now, I think we have some question cards here. I want to make sure to get to your questions. Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, this is a great question. The first one is, how does the influence of special interest groups limit or affect your ability to get things done?
I don't like them at all. So put it that way. I think it's, again, our city, Anaheim's a unique place because we have, it's 350,000 people, but we have 25 million visitors a year. You know, with Disneyland, it's like having a Super Bowl every day. Give you that type of people, and a lot of money floating around. And in fact, if you've been watching the news, we've been in the news lately with a big FBI investigation and some indictments and about that issue, actually, about the role of special interest controlling completely controlling the city, actually. So I think it's, Mayor Lincoln, you were talking about this a lot, about your role as mayor, and it's to be an advocate for the people, to protect their rights, protect people's individual civil rights, and I guess in the common good, and if special interest almost by definition is different from that, and so it's a problem, and I think it gets down to the elected officials and the mayor and remembering who we represent. You have to, and it's tough because that's not the really sexy part of being mayor, is going to the big dinners and everyone treats you well when you're the special interest, and the people in the neighborhood are really more interested in making sure that they earn a living and get their kids off to school and things like that. So you have to constantly remind yourself that's who I represent, and they're looking to me to look out after their interest.
You didn't mention public safety labor unions.
They're huge,
Yeah.
huge.
Police and fire,
The amount of money.
which play a big role here in California.
Huge role.
Yeah.
Huge role. And it's, I put them, in Anaheim, they've all seemed to have kind of coalesced into one big group, actually, and then, but that's a whole other story.
There's actually a great book, by the way, that just came out on this month called Local Interests by Sarah Anzia. She's a professor. It's fantastic. We're going to have a book review coming out on that soon. There's a great question. It's a really nerdy question that I deeply, deeply love. So please bear with me on this one. Which is best? Is it an at-large council system, a district with aldermanic privilege, or a district without aldermanic privilege? So you see aldermanic privilege in the sense of housing is a great example. In New York and Chicago, in Nashville, a lot of other places, if that council member says, I don't want that in my district, and all those special permits got to get the sign off from that council member, then all the other members say, well, we're going to defer to them. And you see other forms of privilege like that. And we used to have a lot more at large, but then we went away during the civil rights era to district. But there's now a debate over whether that was actually needed. Do you have any opinions
I do.
on
District without.
District without.
Yeah.
District without. Is that?
I agree with Mick. We actually started out when I was mayor as at-large, and it was, and again, if you're in Anaheim, it's 22 miles from end to end. I would tell people you could have, Mother Teresa living in West Anaheim, and no one's going to know about her in East Anaheim. And so if the special districts would get together and figure out who their candidates are, and they get elected. So with districts, you have a chance for somebody who's involved in the community, who knows the neighborhoods, to come up, at least have a chance against that money. So I think districts make a lot of sense. And we had a big fight. The special interests fought it. So the special interests didn't want the districts, I'll put it that way. So that tells me that the districts were good.
So I'd say districts without, but all three systems fail without really strong protections for, and streamlining of basic processes within government. You can have Las Vegas's city government is districts without, and yet you probably can't put a slightly larger sign up on your property without it going to a council vote. And beyond it being wildly inefficient, it simply becomes a nexus for rent seeking by other names. Right?
That would never happen. I don't know what you're talking about. So, okay, so another question is similar to what Mayor Johnson was talking about, regional entities. Do you find that regional councils, regional entities, regional groups are on net good, or do you find them to be a hindrance, or are they neutral but worth considering?
Well, they're net necessary because, whether you like them or not, because for large infrastructure projects, you don't get federal money unless your project is in a regional plan of some sort, and those are typically controlled by regional agencies. Here in Southern California, it would be the Southern California Association of Governments. Those agencies are, they're time and resource sinks, but they're not local money sinks as much, because most of them, MPOs, Metropolitan Planning Organizations, most of them lack the teeth to enforce their will. They can force you to be part of a plan. They can't necessarily force you to do a whole lot else. Now, the outlier is the Portland area's Metro, which has the power of a regional government to force individuals and cities into line. Chuck, I hope I'm selling a lot of books for you, but again, back to this model of a vertical model of capital extraction from the federal and state levels. Regional governance entities like MPOs are very effective at that. It's just a giant grant writing and grant collecting organization. Call me not a fan.
So another question hits on something that Mayor Johnson was also talking about: annexation and consolidation. What is your take on this? So there have been fights over this for forever. Nashville is a combined city-county government. We've seen other kind of consolidations like that before. Fights in San Antonio over annexation. Do you find this kind of consolidation, annexation to be good, bad, indifferent? How do you view that dynamic too? Because you do know that there's, you're in competition with your suburbs.
Yeah, first of all, I find it fascinating. You said you were nerding out. Like that's, that city-county consolidation issue, I always find fascinating to read about it and how it took place. And usually, I think it's one of those things that sounds good, and then they finally get it done, and it was so watered down, it really didn't make all the difference they thought, and then there were unintended consequences. So, I don't, you can kind of phrase them as success stories, but I'm not necessarily sure that it's everything they thought it was going to be, and use up a lot of political capital to get that accomplished. When you start eliminating, positions and consolidating positions. I'm glad whatever consolidation was done in Oklahoma City was done in the 1950s and 60s.
Before
I had to deal with it. Those generations that did those types of things in Oklahoma City were very smart, and you heard Mayor Johnson talk about the suburbs, et cetera, and their successes. In Oklahoma City, our city leaders had the foresight to annex all of the transportation corridors. And so we have 3 interstate highways that converge in Oklahoma City, which is really unique. And Oklahoma City's city limits go like this, so that all the sales tax is captured by Oklahoma City. And it's one of the big reasons for Oklahoma City's success decades later, but it has hurt a lot of the municipalities in the suburban areas.
How?
Well, because they don't have the taxation. Sales tax is a significant driver of revenue for Oklahoma municipalities, and they don't have the opportunity to benefit from their own retail that might be serving their citizens. So their citizens are spending retail, which happens to be in the city limits of Oklahoma City, and it's captured by our sales tax base.
There's now a similar, you may have some thoughts as well, and Greg, I'll get to you as well, because I think there's the opposite of this that we see in the Buckhead movement in Atlanta, the Bucksit movement. They're trying to get out, but I know you have some thoughts on it.
Well, it's interesting listening to Mayor Johnson's point of view from the main city to the other cities. And so in Southern California, it's so massive here. I think there's 23 million people in Southern California. And but if you from the outside, people just think it's Los Angeles. So Los Angeles sucks all the air out of the room, and it actually
But
comes
to be
out.
clear, Los Angeles is a tiny, tiny part.
Los-
Right,
it's
of
yeah,
the
it's
rest of.
compared to, it's 23 million. I think Los Angeles maybe 4 million or something. So Orange County, I've actually argued for some sort of consolidation for Orange County being a metro city or something, where you keep all the cities the same, but just some sort of to give us clout, so we're not Los Angeles. So it's bad when I guess it's kind of bad when another city names themselves Dallas after your city. It's worse when your city, where they play, named themselves after Los Angeles. So the Angels switch their names from Anaheim to Los Angeles, and then you're like, why even have a team if that's if you're just a place to play? So but it's I think it's Orange County. Maybe it's unique, but it's if it was a city, it'd be the third largest city in the United States, and so much of this. You mentioned about going back to Sacramento and or going to the state or going to the federal government, and but that's the way the system is. And I know like per capita, the amount of money that Los Angeles has is massively more than any other cities in Southern California per capita.
You know, for a little while, you had the media on your side with that idea, because the Orange County Register, which is the leading paper down there, in the 80s and 90s in the Chris Anderson era, they very specifically branded things as Orange County. They didn't talk about city issues, talked about regional and regionalism issues, and it drove some of the politics back then.
Yeah, and so Orange County, I think, is ripe for it. In fact, you could almost just have the county, rather than the Board of Supervisor chairman, name that person, him or her, mayor, and it'd probably solve about 80% of the issue.
So final question, lessons on governance for mayors of mid-sized cities in particular. Greg, what comes to your mind when you're saying this is what you should do for good governance today?
So a broad answer is, and frankly a self-serving answer, but we talked about nonprofits and working with them earlier. Organizations like Manhattan Institute, Strong Towns, what we're doing with BCP, we are forming a mesh of local government, public policy research, and operational help, right? BCP is in the last mile business. We give model ordinances to cities that are facing problems and don't have the resources internally to figure out how to fix them. That's something somewhat new under the sun. If you look, 10 years ago, it was just Manhattan out there swinging for the fences most of the time. And if you go back further, it's just the League of Cities. And the League of Cities has one job, and that is to help cities get more money out of the state capital, more money out of Washington. So I would say that in your search for best governance practices, that's going to look different in every city. But you've now got resources that you didn't have, 10 years ago to help with that, and that's meaningful.
Resources as well coming from the School of Public Policy and the Davitt Institute here
Absolutely.
here in Pepperdine. Mayor Tait, governance lessons, mid-sized cities.
I would say remember who you represent, I guess, in a nutshell. And then as far as mayor, I think mayors generally don't understand or don't use the power of the bully pulpit that they could use for culture change and real deep, lasting change in their city.
Thanks.
I would say develop coalitions and determine 2 or 3 really big priorities that you hope to accomplish, and make sure that you use your political capital wisely, and don't get pulled into trying to fill other people's agendas. Make sure that you remember the big thing is the big thing, whatever the big thing is.
These are big things and big themes. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.